And we're recording, so I'll take my glasses off here so that we get rid of the computer glare from the screen. Hey, once again, thanks for joining me, everybody. I had a great interview yesterday with Robert Mixa from Word on Fire, and it's posted up on the blog. And tomorrow I'm doing Bob Barron. On Monday, I had Father Harrison, Bishop Bob Barron, I should say, Robert Barron. And then Monday, I had Father Harrison Eyre of Clerically Speaking. So it's been a great week. And today, another treat, we have a man that really needs no introduction, Karl Keating, who founded and runs Catholic Answers. And I think a lot of my viewers are probably very aware of Catholic Answers. And probably your most famous book, right? Catholicism and Fundamentalism. That, wouldn't you say, Karl, that's your most popular book?
Oh, it definitely is the one that sold the best.
Yeah. I remember reading that years ago. You wrote for The Wanderer. You're also a lawyer, right?
A recovering lawyer.
You went to the University of San Diego, I think, got your MA and JD there,
Right.
if I recall correctly from our conversation several months ago when we were at the Chacha's house together here.
That's right.
Anyway, I've only met you in person once, and it was a thoroughly charming meeting. We did a little radio show or blog show, something with some friends of ours. But I really wanted to get you on the show because there's so many things I want to pick your brain about, and you of all people would know. So, hey, you've spent the entirety of your adult career as a Catholic, really, as I guess what we could generically call a Catholic apologist.
Right.
So, why don't we just begin basically for the viewers? Are there different kinds? I mean, are there a Catholic apologist is somebody who defends the Catholic faith?
Well, we should define what a Catholic apologist is, right?
Yes.
And I normally, when I speak to a mixed audience, I'll explain that a Catholic apologist is somebody who goes around the country apologizing for being a Catholic.
I'm so sorry.
And the Catholics in the audience will think for a moment and say, oh, all right. And the Protestants in the audience will say, yeah, just as I suspected. So,
it's about time you apologized.
Right. Well, actually, an apologist for anything is someone who explains and defends that thing. So you can be an apologist for a religious position, a political position, an artistic position. So you can be an apologist for any strongly held idea, really. So a Catholic apologist is somebody who explains and defends the Catholic faith from misunderstandings, confusions, attacks, however it may be.
And what prompted you? I mean, you started this project in the 1980s, correct?
Well, my first public apologetical act probably occurred in 1979. And I say probably because it seems so unimportant to me at the time that I may know note of it later. And so I'm trying to think back as to when it would have been. And the best I can do is calculating on when it was my wife and I lived in an apartment down the street. So I have to work that. And on that one day, on Sunday, I came out of Mass and found flyers on the windshields of all the cars in the parking lot. And I examined the flyer, and it was an anti-Catholic screed. It was against the Mass and against the priesthood. And it was published and distributed by a Protestant fundamentalist church a mile away. And not seeing anybody inclined to do anything about it except to throw away the leaflets, I decided to write up one of my own. So I spent a few nights working up my argument and tried to put the whole corpus of Catholic doctrinal teaching on two sides of one sheet of paper. And then I arranged to type that out. This, Selectric typewriter years, long before computers. So it was a lot of typing and retyping to get it right. I had the thing printed off. I didn't want to put my name on it, because who am I? But I needed to sound authoritative. But here I was, a Catholic giving answers. So I said, I'll pretend there's a group called Catholic Answers. So I put that down.
So that's really the origin of the name. That's great.
That's it. And I wasn't about to put down my home address out of fear that while I was at work, I was still an attorney at the time, while I was at work, some fundamentalists would come to the door and annoy my wife. So I rented a P.O. box. So I printed off these leaflets, and then I went to that church and distributed my leaflets onto the windshields of the cars in its parking lot one Sunday. And then I walked across the street. I remember vividly standing against a light stander across the street, waiting for that church's service to end. And when it did, the first folks out were the deacons or the elders. And they saw the leaflets that I had put, and they started to pluck them off the cars. They weren't fast enough. And the people came out, and most of the congregation got a leaflet. And I said, okay, that's it. I've done my good deed. I'll go away. And that was all that I expected. But then it occurred to me I should go maybe a week later to the P.O. box to see if somebody maybe had responded. It was stuffed full of letters. Now, most of them were from members of that church, but some were from Catholics, and how they got my flyer, I have no idea. But they said, oh, this is great stuff. Send us your catalog. And I said, I wrote back and said, I'm sorry, at the moment, everything's out of print. But once everything's in print, then I'll
This is where you were exposed as a fraud. The Catholic Answers was a front.
I immediately sat down and revised that tract and 5 more, so I had half a dozen. And then started to pass them out, I forget now how. And people asked for more copies, and they said, oh, I want to distribute this at my parish. Can I have 100 copies or 500 copies? Whatever. I wrote another 6 because there was a demand for other topics. And then I had 12 for a few months. I wrote another 12, and eventually I wrote 48. And this was all during the time that I was practicing law. But the more I got into doing this other stuff, the less I practiced law.
Yeah, well, that was fortuitous, right? That they put those under your windshield wiper, and you launched an entirely new career, and in a sense walked away from not entirely walked away. I'm assuming you probably dabbled still here and there in your law practice. You probably had an occasion when the IRS came after Catholic. Didn't the IRS come after Catholic Answers at one point? Oh,
no, not really. Nothing substantial. I mean,
okay.
No, I don't mean nonprofit forums and all. But I practiced law for another decade.
By the way, I want to stop you for a second. I mean, I didn't mean to insinuate that there's a cloud hanging over Catholic Answers.
Oh, no.
I meant that you were unfairly attacked. Somebody put the IRS after you unfairly, is what I read somewhere.
Not that I recollect.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
It only goes to show, don't believe everything that you read on the interwebs. Absolutely. So anyway, so then you wrote the book Catholicism Fundamental, and you wrote for I remember The Wanderer. This, for some of my viewers won't know what The Wanderer is, but for those of us who are of our age, you and I, Karl, I'm 63. I think you're a little older. We won't divulge by how much. And for our generation,
I am past the biblical 70.
Okay, there you go.
Okay,
so let's just say that. And so you're among the strong. All right. Yeah, according to the Psalm. So for those of us pre-internet, The Wanderer was the go-to paper for those of us of a conservative traditionalist sort of leaning back in the day. And after the Second Vatican Council, especially in the 70s, there were not a lot of print sources that one could turn to if one was a sort of conservative Catholic, and you felt besieged on all sides. I remember The Wanderer used to have these really long articles. So you wrote for The Wanderer for how many years?
Well, the only thing really I wrote was to be the draft of Catholicism and fundamentalism. And that came about by my contacting the editor at the time and proposing a 3-part series of about 3,000 words per part, which is sort of long for a newspaper, but for The Wanderer, it wasn't especially long. Yeah. And I said, I think I can cover most of the charges from fundamentalism in these 3 episodes. Would you be interested? And they would be printed 3 weeks in a row. He said, yeah, fine. So I wrote the first one and spent a lot of time doing that and sent it off, and then realized I can't do it really in 3. So I asked him, could I have 5 episodes? That's fine. By the time I finished 3 or 4, I wrote back and said, actually, I need 8 installments of this. Okay. That kept going on. I ended up writing 30 weekly pieces of 3,000 words apiece. And that was the first draft, close to the final draft, actually, of Catholicism and Fundamentalism. So I guess I was writing these in probably starting late 1986 into 1987. And the book came out in 1988.
There you go. And your fame was launched. How would you say that? Okay, so that's kind of how you got to where we are. Now, what would you say is different about doing apologetics today from back, say, in the 80s? Obviously, I would think that there are new challenges and new things that need to be defended, especially, say, with the rise of hyper-traditionalism, radical traditionalism, whatever you want to call it in the church, that might look at your version of a kind of conservative Catholicism as not quite pure enough, or whatever you want to call it. So what do you make of those two things? How do we do apologetics today, and sort of speaking to the non-evangelized? And how do we speak to the traditionalists?
Well, let me take a step back here. I think that in part the audience needing apologetics has changed over the decades. When I was doing apologetics in the first years, it was almost exclusively countering the fundamentalist challenge.
Right.
That was big. Back in the late 70s into the early 80s, about 100,000 Catholics in the US per year left the church to become fundamentalists. Now, others just dropped out, of course, and became nothing. But 100,000 people per year. I knew of fundamentalist churches in which every single congregant had been a Catholic. So that was a big thing at the time. It's not that it's disappeared now. We still see some traffic going that way. But back then it was a one-way street. You almost never heard of a fundamentalist becoming a Catholic, but you could not but know people who had been Catholic who became fundamentalists.
And that was the heyday of the whole Bible prophecy movement, the moral majority, all that.
All that stuff. So that issue is still there. There are still people who write anti-Catholic tracts and books and anti-Catholic websites and so on from that point of view. But as time went on, I think the larger problem for Catholics became indifferentism and almost a hyper-indifferentism within the church and outside the church. I wouldn't say so much it was the traditionalist issue. I would say the focus has changed more in, say, the last 20 years from concern about the fundamentalist assault on the church to the so what about it assault on the church. The people who simply don't care. They may be Catholics nominally. Yeah. They may be non-Catholics. They may subscribe to some religion, no religion, but they attack the church regardless, because at the root, their religion is indifferentism. And they don't think that one ought to have a principled position that then with which one wants to inform the society. Okay. So I would say that today the biggest problem for the church in America looking at challenges from other groups is not so much from the fundamentalist end as it had been, but more from the indifferent end, and that's stronger. Now, you brought up the issue of traditionalism, and I would consider myself a traditional Catholic, but not a traditionalist Catholic. So small t versus a capital T. I think a lot of the traditionalist stuff has turned into a kind of closed society. When I wrote Catholicism and Fundamentalism, I think this will appeal to you. And I wasn't thinking in quite these terms, but it was a ressourcement kind of approach. Yeah. Because when I wrote this book, I had two audiences in mind. The first was the Catholic audience, of course. I mean, the initial articles were in the Wanderer and exclusively read by Catholics. But as I kept in the back of my mind that I wanted this to be a book also. And I wanted it to be a book that would appeal to the fundamentalist audience. So Catholics first, fundamentalists second. But I knew that if I were to try to talk about the faith with a fundamentalist, I could not try to prove Catholic distinctives by way of papal decrees and conciliar statements, because they give no authority to popes or to councils. So I limited myself to three things: scripture, early church history, and common sense. And it's that middle one, early church history, that really amounts to going back to the fathers of the church.
Yeah.
The Rationale and seeing the way I used it was not so much seeing what Augustine or Ignatius of Antioch or whomever might have said about something doctrinally. I more emphasized the historical approach. Here is evidence from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries of what Christians believed at that time. They weren't necessarily trying to prove their faith always to a non-Christian. They often just were explaining it to themselves, saying, this is what we believe. Right. And that's truth. So when it's a question of ought infants to be baptized or not, you go back and you find instances of bishops explaining the procedure to be used when baptizing infants. Well, they weren't trying to demonstrate from Scripture that infant baptism was proper, as though they were defending it against opponents. They were just saying, in the church, this is the procedure we use. Okay. So,
and also giving the impression that it's just always been this way.
It's always been this way. Yeah, you don't find anybody complaining about it. I mean, for example, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist isn't complained about by anyone until Berengarius of Tours a millennium later. Okay, so you've got people in especially the early centuries simply explaining how they do things, how they believe, with not trying to defend the faith against attacks of the time so much as just laying things out. And I thought that was strong evidence. So I brought that kind of thing into Catholicism and fundamentalism as a key component of laying out the Catholic position. Because if I could show that the Christians of the first half millennium believed such and so about whatever doctrine, and that was distinct from Lutheranism or Calvinism or something else on that point, then my interlocutor would have a little trouble explaining why the early Christians believed that and why, from the Reformation on, many Christians didn't. Okay.
Yeah. And I remember that's got to be very effective. I mean, just to speak autobiographically, I mean, I'm a cradle Catholic, but I did go through a period in my teen years where I rejected Catholicism and embraced the whole dispensationalist, evangelical, Bible prophecy, born again movement, and I became that, and I became very anti-Catholic as a young man. But what kind of turned me around, in some way, I started reading C.S. Lewis. It turned me on to Chesterton. It turned me on to Newman, and I started reading those guys. But what really turned me around was reading some of the early church fathers, just like you said, and realizing, I mean, Newman's famous statement, to be steeped in history is to cease to be Protestant. I don't think that's necessarily entirely true. I don't think that's entirely fair to our Protestant brothers and sisters, but it was, at least for me, and I think for many other people, just like you said, it's eye-opening when you go back to the earliest extant writings we have of some of the immediate post-apostolic fathers, and you realize, holy cow, they're talking about bishops, and they're talking about priests, and they're talking about the Eucharist, and you realize, wait a minute, this is Catholicism I'm seeing here.
Yeah,
so the whole,
you got
go ahead.
In the early centuries, they've got disputes in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and they are appealing to the Bishop of Rome for a resolution. Why? Why don't they just settle it themselves or go to the local bishop or the near half dozen bishops? They go all the way over to Italy to get some authoritative statement from that bishop. Why? What does that tell us? Uh, when Newman was writing his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which came out in 1845, he, in the process of writing it, became Catholic. It was in the very process of in that book, taking the Catholic distinctive of the 19th century and going back century by century and looking at, did this Catholic distinctive, was it held in the 18th century, in the 17th, in the 16th, going all the way back and saying, yes, I can find this thing all the way back to the earliest writings we have. And he did this repeatedly with various Catholic beliefs. And he said, obviously, in terms of outward appearance, shall we say, many beliefs look different. I mean, we look different than we did compared to when we were 6 years old, but we're the same people. And so he pointed out that this is the same doctrine. And the Catholic Church may have, over the centuries, thought through it, investigated it, and so on. And so it's understood more deeply. He would understand the Trinity more deeply, say, in theory, than Aquinas could, who would understand it more deeply than Augustine could, who would understand it more deeply than the apostles could. As Frank Sheet said, once you have a truth, you can't prevent people from trying to draw true conclusions from that truth. And that you build up true conclusions over the centuries. Yeah. And so Newman, in a way, finalized his own conversion by writing that book. And because it confirmed for him that the Catholic faith and its distinctives go all the way back.
Okay, so let's go back to that group you were talking about before, the group that we would simply call those who are indifferent, religiously indifferent. Are they moved by these kinds of evidences, these kinds of arguments on the level of evangelization? And I'm not necessarily talking about Catholics who just no longer practice the faith. I'm also talking about maybe Catholics, for the sake of their kids or whatever, still go to church now and then, but really do internally think along the lines of a kind of relativist, indifferentist mentality. Are they open to these kinds of evidences, or does apologetics have to take a different, maybe non-debate format kind of an approach? You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do, because the answer is yes, it does have to take such a different approach. In a way, it's easy, even if very frustrating, to argue with a fundamentalist. But that's somebody who accepts a large part of Christian truth as an absolute given. And sometimes we're talking about substantive things, sometimes just things on the periphery. But he's willing to argue. He's willing to use reason. Maybe he doesn't always use it well, but that's his mode. The indifferent person is commonly one who doesn't authentically reason about much of anything, and whether in politics or philosophy or art appreciation or whatever. And approaching that person is more difficult. You can't simply throw out a doctrinal claim, and have the person respond to it, say, "Oh, you're wrong. You Catholics don't know what you're talking about. And the Bible says such and so, and then you get into a discussion, you can prove something." Rather, that indifferent person says, "Oh, okay, so what? Oh, God exists? Okay, so what? Yeah. Why should that change my life? If Jesus Christ is God, he rose from the dead? Oh, that's fine, so what?" So,
yeah.
That's much more difficult to deal with. And you might get to the point that such a person will bring up what he thinks is a shut down discussion claim from Catholic history. And that might give you an entree into leading him to the point where you can see that he swallowed a lot of things that were not well considered, that just aren't so. And you can begin a discussion. But oftentimes you don't get that kind of opening. And so it's very difficult to deal with the indifferent person compared to the very intense person of animosity like a fundamentalist might be.
Yeah. And it's a tough egg to crack with the indifferent, because it's essentially something rooted in our culture. So you're not just fighting it, you're fighting it. It's what Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary. The whole world in which our mind exists is formed by the culture, and the social imaginary of our culture is that if you believe in God, it's like a private choice. It's no big deal. Believe, not believe, who cares? And that they've sort of imbibed that, and that's a really hard thing to crack. So I would say that I would propose that apologetics has to, and I'm sure you would agree with this, and it's probably something you've written about somewhere that I haven't read. So bear with me. But apologetics has to be more than simply books and arguments. In order to, in a sense, re-evangelize, if you want to call it that, those who are in the great masses of Catholics who fall simply into our cultural matrix, perhaps we need to look at creating a deeper and more profound spiritual atmosphere in our parishes, beginning with the liturgy, beginning with the community life in the parish, beginning with maybe a much stronger emphasis on things like mysticism and prayer and the sort of theosis, divinization, these kinds of things that appeal to modern people. And the reason why I say that is because no matter how indifferent you are, everybody is eventually going to reach some sort of crisis in their life. A death of a loved one, your own health crisis, death, God forbid, of a child, those sorts of things. And those crisis moments are when people naturally want to turn to God. And if the church is there with, as Bishop Barron would say, beauty, and not just beauty as in, oh, that's a pretty picture, but the beauty of the full orbed, robust gospel, liturgically, ascetically, spiritually, then I think we could go a long ways towards creating an apologia, in a sense, a defense of the church.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's needed. And one of our problems is that we don't come across as being very beautiful, either in our liturgies, in our church buildings. In those, to a large extent, we've accommodated ourselves to others rather than building something to which, at the appropriate moment, they could come to accommodate themselves. So you have somebody who is hurting for whatever reason. Yeah. He walks into the average Catholic parish, and there's nothing there to marvel the eye. He sits through the liturgy or stands at the back. There's nothing especially distinctive there. I keep bringing to mind how Paul Claudel reconverted in a way. He had been, later on in life, the French ambassador to Japan, then to the US, playwright, scholar, but he had fallen away from his youthful faith. And what happened to him is one day he found himself in Notre Dame. And he wrote about this later. He said he stood at the second pillar on the right during, I don't think it was a mass, I think it might have been benediction. And he said he received what we almost might call a revelation, just that the Catholic faith was true. He just had a sense that it was. And then he went out later and read up on it the way he should have years earlier to verify. But he had that sense from the beauty of what he saw.
Right,
and
right.
From the devotion he saw of the people who were there in Notre Dame at the time, that there is something here that's true and beautiful and good. And now I have an image of that. I have an acceptance of that. But now I have to figure out why. But he was induced to do that. Is there any analog of that at most of our parishes in terms of the obvious reverence of the congregation, of the actual beauty of the liturgy in the building?
No.
It's a tougher sell in that sense. I mean, I think it's a tougher thing for the Holy Spirit to get the grace through in the contemporary physical ambiance than it was when Claudel, a century or more ago now, was in Notre Dame.
I agree. A couple of points here. First off, It's interesting, is it not, that a lot of the church architecture after the Second Vatican Council, not just in terms of new churches, but the renovation of older churches, so emphasized, if you will, the sort of the horizontal and the fellowship nature of the Mass, and statues removed and artwork removed and so on. The felt banner Catholicism of our youth. And the irony is that all of that was done in order to foment and create community. And yet the exact opposite happened. All right. It didn't create community. And my attitude would be the reason why it didn't was because there was nothing enticing about it. There was nothing intriguing about it. It was banal, and it actually drove people apart because it drove them simply to their suburban attached garage cul-de-sac lives. The Mass simply reflected that. And so that's, I would say, beauty is a necessary condition for doing apologetics in the vein we're talking about here, but not a sufficient one. So,
Right.
that eventually once someone is hooked by the beauty, then they need a more intellectual set of answers. Like,
Yes,
okay,
they need to have something that opens their mind. Okay.
right,
And
exactly.
often it could be beauty. Larry, you know that I'm an avid backpacker, and
Yes.
I've got 6 or 8 Sierra Nevada backpacking trips scheduled between this month and September. One of them is going to be on what's considered generally to be the most beautiful backpacking area in the country, which is the Ray Lakes Loop in Kings Canyon National Park. And it's a 42-mile loop. And you get to a point where you've got these alpine lakes in front of you, and in the background are these craggy, very tall granite spires. They remind people of cathedrals. And you get out there, and you maybe camping next to people who are of the indifferentist sort. But they get out there and say, when I see these things and look up at them and the size, and they take me up into the sky, into the heavens, I have a sense of God's presence, even though they're not religious people. Well, in the Middle Ages, Catholic architects tried to emulate that kind of sense in their buildings. And so
Gothic.
Exactly. And even before, Norman-esque and others, they were tall. They weren't low ceiling like the room I'm in now. They sort of force your eyes to go up, and in the process, you begin to, as these people out in the Sierra say, begin to have a sense of God. Okay. So the beauty that so many people appreciate in nature, when they're properly situated, at least, that kind of thing can happen architecturally in a church if the church is done right. And yes, and then when that happens, I think they begin to be open to an intellectual examination of this. So the beauty is a very important element, more so now when we live in a rather scrungy society where beauty has been dumbed down, if I may put it that way.
Well, it really has. I remember a great video produced by the BBC with the philosopher Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, called Why Beauty Matters. And I don't agree with all of Scruton's conclusions. He's a bit of a Kantian, I think, and that comes through. Nevertheless, what he points out is that there is a secular analog to this. I mean, you pointed out the vaulted stars at night while backpacking. He pointed out why is it that all of these major urban centers are now, in a sense, retrieving all of these old sort of Art Deco buildings or even older buildings and turning them into restaurants and coffee shops and bars and bookstores and things like that, where all of the chrome and glass monstrosities of modernity last maybe 20 years, then get torn down, and nobody wants to work or live in them. And I think that's so very true, that the human heart needs this kind of. I'm reminded, and then I'll turn it back to you. I had a spiritual director when I was in the seminary, Father Anton Morgenroth. He was a Holy Ghost priest, was a missionary for many years in Africa, but he was actually a convert from Judaism. He grew up in Berlin, and his family fled Nazi Germany. They were one of the lucky ones that got out, and they fled to England. And he took a job as a longshoreman in London, just to make ends meet as a young man. But he was a musician. He was a pianist, and he loved going into the Catholic churches that he discovered there. And he would sit in the back pew during Mass or benediction, and he would listen to the Gregorian chant. And he would look at the architecture. And that moved him to want to explore Catholicism more. He kind of grew up a rather secularized Jewish person. And so it wasn't like he had this huge Jewish resistance to Catholicism. But once again, it's just one more story, like your story of the hikers out in the desert looking up into the vaults. Here's a Jewish man who converts and then becomes a priest because of the beauty of the Gregorian chant and the architecture he saw in the churches of London. Yep. And yet, how often do we talk about this?
Well, I don't think there's any recorded evidence that anybody ever had that kind of conversion looking at a Sister Created Kent felt banner.
That's right.
Just didn't happen. But there are lots of stories of people who seem to have no religious impulse at all, who enter a Catholic church, listen to the Mass or benediction or what have you, and come away, well, with a good kind of cognitive dissonance. They begin to think, I'm missing something. I don't know what it is I'm missing, but I just got an intimation of it. And now what do I do?
Yeah, what is the number one tourist destination in all of Spain? It's in Barcelona. It is the Sagrada Familia Cathedral. And what only goes, which incorporates both uber traditional and uber modern features. It's not completely done. And I was just reading an article the other day of the thousands and thousands of people that have converted to the faith simply by walking into that cathedral.
Yes. Moderns often forget that we are people of five senses.
Yeah.
And the senses, when activated properly, can change our whole beings. It might be what we hear, but it's often what we see. And when we see beauty, or hear, we might hear, the Gregorian chant or what have you. It does more than just give us some fleeting happiness of the moment. It actually can begin to change our souls into inquirers. Our souls want to, they sense there's something I'm missing. And now the problem is, where do I go now? It's not obvious where to find the answer to whatever bubbling questions I might have, where to find the fulfillment that I'm seeking. It used to be easier to do that, I think, but we live in such a cold era. It's a commonplace to say you walk the streets of any big city, and it's like you're not there.
It's true. There's a sort of beehive sort of feel to things. There's an anonymity to things, an impersonalist quality to modern life. There's an atomization that takes place in modern life where we're isolated as these little monadic individuals. That's why I made fun earlier of the sort of cul-de-sac with my friend Dr. Rodney Hauser likes to say that civilization began to collapse with the invention of the attached garage, because now you can actually drive your car home. The garage door opens automatically with your garage door up. You can drive into your garage, go immediately into your home, and you no longer have to talk to your neighbors. You don't have to step out of your car. I still remember growing up, we did not have attached garage, and you get out of your car in the driveway and you wave to your neighbor who was out watering his lawn or whatever. Now you don't even have to have those basic interactions. I know a fellow who lives in the suburbs. He's lived in the same house with the same neighbors for like 15 years. I asked him, so what, just as a little experiment, I said, what's your neighbor's name? He goes, I have no idea. I never talked to him. I have no idea what their names are.
Well, I've had that similar thought, but I think your friend is wrong about the detached garage. What the laws came because there no longer are houses with porches. And
there you go. I think he would agree with that. I think Rodney would agree with that.
You can't sit out in front having your mint julep, watching the neighbors walk by, and be somewhat protected from the sun or the elements, and then walk across the street and sit at his porch. That's how it was when I was a child in Chicago. We lived in an area that had porches. And so you had that interaction with your neighbors. I
A
live in
lot
an
of it had to
area.
do because a lot of people didn't have air conditioning, and so you sat out on the front porch just to escape the stifling heat inside your house.
Well, that's true, but it forced you to be in contact, at least visually, with
Yeah.
your neighbors, and
Oh
then you
yeah.
got
That
into
yeah.
better contact with them. You know, so yeah, that's we
And
become.
so the point is to bring it back to the discussion here, which is apologetics. I mean, our churches cannot be places that reinforce that cultural dynamic.
No,
Okay.
no, they shouldn't be. Uh, I thought you were going to go a somewhat different tack, but so I'll just bring this up. I think one of the failures that we've had for decades is that there's very little catechesis or apologetics from the pulpit, and you got people coming to the church habitually for decades. And if you were to take them when they step outside the church and ask them any basic question about the faith, they would not be able to answer you. And these are people who consider themselves good Catholics. I mean, they're don't have to go to mass every Sunday, but they still, if they were put on the spot by a traveling missionary with a question, they'd be stuck. Okay.
Yeah.
Years ago, I had proposed to a priest who lived in Illinois, but near the Wisconsin border, that he try to institute what I would call the apologetics homily, in which, homily is supposed to be about the readings of the day. But whatever the readings are, you can turn that in a way to show the parishioners that they too could answer challenges that they might get. So let's say a reading is from, John chapter 6, it concerns the Eucharist and the real presence of Christ. And so you could not just give us the standard homily on that, but the priest could say, okay, maybe you have somebody coming to your door, like a Jehovah's Witness once came to my door and challenged me about the real presence. And in that case, I said, do you have a Bible? They did. They had their New World Translation, which is an adjusted Bible, put it that way. And I said, good, let's turn to John 6 and let's go through it. And these are actually with two women. One was a former Methodist, the other a former Catholic. So which one I zeroed in on. And I said, let's walk through John 6. Okay. And, I showed them what they never got at their services, because I think that's a chapter that at their churches is never discussed. But so I was telling this priest, you could have what I call the apologetics homily. If the readings are about baptism, you can ask your congregants, do you ever get challenged by non-Catholics about what baptism does? Is it just symbolic? Does it actually do something to you internally? Does it make a difference to your soul? And then the priest could discuss baptism, the readings of the day, in that sense. So I recommended this to this priest. Now, he'd been assigned as the associate pastor of this parish. It had about 200 people a week at the noon mass, which is the only mass that he always was celebrating. So the only mass that he could really do much about. And so he instituted this. And within 6 months, he had 500 people every week at his mass.
Yes.
Where do these people come from? Well, some were coming from other masses, but in many cases, they were family members of those who had been attending mass, but who had dropped out, these family members. And the ones who were at mass went home and said, hey, Father explained such and such to us today, how to answer these challenges. Why don't you come with us next Sunday? So they did. So by this process of the apologetics homily, this priest was able to bring back hundreds of people within that parish's own boundaries, hundreds of them back to the church when they had just fallen into indifference and were just staying home on Sundays.
There you go. I am so glad you're raising this issue of homiletics as a form of apologetics. And I was eventually going to get there. So thank you for anticipating my question, because this has been a hobby horse of mine for a very, very long time. First off, I mean, people know I was in the seminary, and full disclosure, I'm actually a laicized transitional deacon. I was 2 months away from priesthood when I backed off and said, no, I'm going to pursue a theology degree instead. Ministry's not for me. So I got laicized. But my point is, I gave homilies when I was a deacon. And my homilies, a couple of things. In other words, I violated everything I was taught in seminary. All right?
Yeah.
And the first thing that I violated was I wrote my homilies out. And I thank God Cardinal Newman wrote his homilies out. Thank God Augustine did. Many of the other church fathers did, or else we wouldn't have them anymore. Imagine if Newman just winged it. If he just decided, okay, I'm going to read the gospel 2 hours before Mass and then maybe jot down 3 ideas on a note card and then go and wing the homily, which is sadly what a lot of priests do. Or they use homiletic services where they just get little tiny homilies, and it's all pablum and watered down. So that's the first thing I would say. In other words, I was a very successful preacher, and my pastor started having me preach at every Mass, even a Mass I wasn't necessarily the deacon at, because this is so Catholic, right? He noticed an uptick in donations in the plate when I preached.
Yes.
And I'm not tooting my own horn, like, look how great I was a good teacher when I was a teacher, and I was a good homilist when I was a homilist because I've kissed
in most parishes, this is a low bar to pass.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm simply saying I reached a certain level of competence that they were not used to. And the point is, though, all joking aside, was I stayed with the readings. That we're not talking about just giving a sermon that's nothing to do with the readings. You stay with the readings, but you use those readings as a catalyst for a re-evangelizing that involves a lot of apologetics. And you really can't do that unless you write your homilies out. And the other advantage to writing your homilies out is that you can, in this day and age too, you can even record them. Our pastor here at our parish posts them on the parish's webpage. You can download his homilies either in written or audio form, which I think is a brilliant idea. The second point that I would make, one is write your homilies out, or that. The second point to make is don't be worried if your homilies are too long. And this goes against some advice that not too long, but long. Pope Francis is always saying, keep your homilies short, keep your homilies short. And I can respect that. And for most homilies that I hear, I wish they were short. Blessedly 5 minutes. Now sit down, Father. You've said 5 minutes of nothing. But I've also listened to homilies just as a lay person, I'm sure you can vouch for this, that went on for 20 minutes and it seemed like 30 seconds because you were hanging on every word that priest said because it was just so darn good.
Exactly.
And it hit. You don't have to be a jerk, and no one's talking about getting up there and being some thundering Jonathan Edwards, sinners and the hangry of God, some sort of mega church evangelist. But you do, in a sense, from the pulpit, Karl, what you did in writing all those years in various installments. And I think you'd bring back people in droves. I really do.
I do. You mentioned Newman, and he was a man of a soft voice. He wrote out his sermons. They're available. I have the complete set of his writings.
Yeah.
I go through his sermons. His Anglican sermons are far better than almost any Catholic sermon you'll hear nowadays.
Yeah.
To my mind, Newman's analog in the 20th century was Monsignor Ronald Knox.
Yes.
Again, probably the most brilliant convert of the century in England, as Newman was of the 19th. Knox wrote out his sermons, and I'm just happy to be going through one of the volumes this week. Knox had, I think, a bit of a more lively mode of presentation than Newman, but he's still subdued by modern standards. After all, he's a man who wrote detective stories, so he would have a different attitude somewhat than Newman. But both men wrote them out, and they were longer than 20 minutes. You can't read them in 20 minutes with any attention. You'd have to race through them. But they were of substance, and they were intriguing. And I have to think that, as a rule, parishioners left saying, I wish he had said a little more about such and so,
Yeah, exactly.
But one of the problems is if you learned it in Wayne Seminary, and priests since that time have. Keep it short, keep it sweet, and keep it extemporaneous if you can.
Oh, and start with a story. Start with a story or a joke.
Or joke, yeah. Often people who want to point to effective extemporaneous Catholic teaching will point to Fulton Sheen. Say, because even those who are not very conservative dispositions will point to his Life is Worth Living show of the 1950s and say, look what he did. You can say plenty just off the top. That's not how Sheen did things. In his television show, he wrote out his script completely,
Sure,
as you would write your sermons. Then he reduced it to 3x5 cards, and then he memorized the 3x5 cards. Then he got in front of the camera. It looked extemporaneous. It wasn't at all. Okay.
That's how I taught, Karl. I was pretty much a chalk talk lecturer. And what I would do is I would write my lectures out, then reduce them to just basic note cards, and then memorize those cards. And you knew your subject matter so well inside and out that you were able then to appear like you were speaking extemporaneously. There's also a way, and you know this too, when you say write out your homilies, people automatically hear, oh, that's going to be boring. It's like reading, it's like a lecture. He's just reading an academic paper. No. There's a way that you can write as if you're speaking.
Knox did this wonderfully. You read
Yes.
Ronald Knox's homilies, it's as though you're in a living room with him talking. Okay.
Yes.
He's got standard English. He doesn't reduce it to slang or something.
Yes.
But it's not a falsely elevated formalistic English either.
Right.
But he's got, British turns of phrase that we Americans would smile at maybe. But to me, it's almost the perfect way to write something that also will be spoken to an audience that needs to hear these things. So Newman was a little more formalistic than Knox.
Oh yeah.
But nevertheless, of course, he had an audience that was more capable of absorbing these things. You look, for example, at the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the 1858 and thereabouts. Those men talk for a couple hours at a time at great depth with considerable use of the language. And they held their audiences, hundreds of people who were gathered in to hear them because, no amplification in those days. But Americans were better trained to listen back then than they are today.
Yeah, people had greater attention spans because it's a different era. Technology has changed things. But I would submit that most Catholics would not be upset at all if homilies went a little bit longer, if those homilies had substance. Yes. And we're actually speaking to their souls, to issues, because I'm telling you, since I started my blog, and you probably get this a million times more than I do. People email me, and I'm sure they email you and say, "Oh, I have to ask you this question because so and so, my friend at work or my husband's friend has come after me because of this and other thing in the Catholic faith, and I, quite frankly, I don't know how to answer it." And so what's your answer to this? And so I'll, patiently write something back. You can't do that though when you get hundreds of emails like that, as I'm sure you do. So it's a shame that they're just not getting more of that in the church, because they are getting it on the street. They're getting that challenge on the street.
They are, from whether it's from the fundamentalist side, the Catholic traditionalist side, the indifferentist side, whatever, they're getting challenged, and they have 1 hour a week, most of them, in which they're susceptible to Catholic teaching. That's that hour when they're at Mass. And we really ought to be taking full advantage of that. So whether it's a 5-minute or 25-minute homily, if that's composed with true substance in it, you don't need the jokes. You don't need the references to the ball games and this kind of stuff. You don't need that stuff. But you need authentic priestly preparation or diaconal preparation to compose something that will strike the minds and the hearts of those people. But it's got to be substantive. There's got to be meat there.
It does.
You've got to be taking them a step beyond what they came into the church with. Okay. And if you only leave them with the pabulum that they normally have received, then it's a waste of time. Then you want the 2-minute homily as a courtesy.
Okay, so now this leads me into two other questions with regard to apologetics. First, we both are aware of the fact that a lot of modern Catholic apologetics is done by lay people. people like you. And that's certainly a great thing. One of the great things of the Second Vatican Council is how lay people are now theologians and apologists and that kind of thing. But there's also, in the Catholic faith, there is no substitute for the priest.
Right.
And we need more priests to get involved in doing apologetics, because theirs is the strongest voice. And that leads me to point number 2, which is absolutely critical, that priests read, that priests have something to say. So those are the 2 points I want you to comment. How critical is the priest? And number 2, how do we get priests to have a continuing education?
Look, it's a common place to say you can't share what you don't have.
Right.
And that's in terms of your money, in terms of your skills, in terms of your knowledge. If you don't have it, you can't share it with anybody else. And priests and deacons who give homilies today, to my mind, are mostly unprepared. They simply have not, they don't have the background. They don't have the substance. You need to have a lot of reading behind you. Samuel Johnson once said, a man will turn over a whole library to write one book. Well, that's sort of an extreme example, but you have to go beyond the homily helps. You have to go beyond what you read online if you're a priest or deacon who's going to be preaching. Okay. You need to have true substance. You need to be reading Catholic books that will inform you so that you have something to bring out. Okay. And you're right about the priests. I mean, the priests are the ones in positions of authority. Ideally, there'd be no role for Catholic lay apologists. They wouldn't be needed.
Yeah.
Because,
or needed less, at least.
Yeah, but the priest in every parish would be fulfilling that role and would be filling their people with what those people could absorb regarding the faith. Now, I'd like to point out that, Catholic apologetics, at least in the English-speaking world, isn't only post-Vatican II. It goes back
way
in
back.
regard to lay people, certainly to the early part of the 20th century, with Frank Sheed, Maisie Ward, the Catholic Evidence Guild, and so on. Sheed, in my mind, was the greatest apologist of the last century. And he did most of his work before Vatican II. But it was after Vatican II that you
That's
found
a good point.
A kind of efflorescence of lay apologetic work. And that's going on today, and I'm pleased to see that. But I hope it's never used as an excuse by priests not to do what they ought to be doing. I mean, there was a time when we had what I like to call the Bing Crosby Church. Remember the Bells of St. Mary's and these other movies?
Yeah.
And there was an era where, let Father do it. If there's a problem, let Father take care of it. I'm just a layman. Let Father do it. Well, I got into apologetics largely because Father wasn't doing it. Okay. And laymen had to take that role. And that was good in that at least things were done. But we don't want to then say, we don't want priests to be saying the reverse of that. Oh, now that there's so much lay apologetics, let the lay folks do it. I won't bother. Okay, that's not healthy. We need the priest to be leading in this work.
Yeah, I think the priest is central. I mean, that's a great point too about Frank Sheed and so on, because there were lay people before the council doing apologetics. I was thinking more in terms of the fact that you've seen this explosion of lay theologians after the council that you didn't have before. So that's a good correction there on your part, because there were some good lay apologists before the council. But with regard to the priest, one of the reasons why I emphasize his role is precisely because he's got the most visibility. I mean, the vast majority of Catholics, their one lone exposure to any explanation of the faith is going to be that homily on a Sunday.
That's right.
The vast majority of them are not going to be reading a Karl Keating or a Larry Chapp book or pamphlet or something, unless it's stuck under their windshield, and maybe then they throw it away. Who knows? And that's why I think the role of the priest is said. No, I can see a lot of my good priest friends rolling their eyes saying, okay, the problem is the modern priest is so busy, right? We don't have time to read and continue and educate. We don't have time to sit down and write out our homilies. We don't have time to do apologetics for 15 or 20 minutes every Sunday. And my response to this is, number one, I sympathize. I understand you're busy, you're overworked. But if you're too busy to read and to preach, then you're too busy.
That's right.
You know, and something else has to suffer.
Yes. I mean, this, to me, forming their parishioners is the number one task of the priests.
Right.
I mean, they heal them in the confessional, they feed them at Mass, but at Mass they feed them in two ways, not just with the Eucharist, but they should be feeding them intellectually also. Because the human person has different aspects, and we need to make sure each one of those is healthy. And you can have somebody who's devout and yet adult, D-O-L-T, not A-D-U-L-T, but adult. That's not good for the church. We need intelligent Catholics who are so well informed that they can share the faith with others, with people in their family, and then beyond their family to others. And as you say, the main avenue for that is going to be the priest. If a priest doesn't focus on that, then he's got his focus aimed in some wrong directions. I mean, and things that no doubt are good, but maybe he's spending too much time with administrative duties in the parish, what have you. But it would seem to me also, I mean, even for the priest should use this calculus. If I've got parishioners who are more understanding of the faith, they become more on fire for the faith. They want to do things for the faith, and they will do things for me at the parish. You know, so I mean, granted that will take a long time to build up, but that can happen. So, yeah, I sympathize with the priests, but I think many of them were sort of brought up in a kind of entrepreneurial, business-like culture of the church as a business. And there's elements of that, of course, that have to be, but there's maybe too much of that rather than more of a kind of prophetic office, as Newman wrote about, where there's a role that the priest needs to fulfill, and it's multiple roles, but one of those roles is teaching. And he's got that short homily period every week. He needs to make good use of it.
And it should be used. It should absolutely be used. Before we completely, we're a little over an hour. I don't like to go much longer in these interviews, maybe an hour and 15, hour and 20. But what would you say? I mean, we're both old coots now, but what would you say are the unique challenges in terms of evangelizing and the use of apologetics in evangelizing to the current generation of want of a better word, youth in the United States, say people ages 20 and under? It strikes me that the digital age is different from the analog age. It strikes me that our culture is now more radically indifferent to religion than before. I mean, you see all the statistics about, young people, where we're hemorrhaging young people out of the church. I don't have a good handle on that. I have not yet coalesced a strong set of thoughts around the causes, the remedies. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't know if I have much to say about the causes, certainly. But one thing I've noticed in the 4 decades or so that I've been doing apologetics, and here I'm referring to with respect to younger folks, there's less interest in, on their part, an ability to deal with the rational argument part. Most young people now are not educated during their school years to do thinking per se. There used to be a time when even high schoolers took courses in logic, of all things. That doesn't exist anymore. You have people who emote, but you don't have people who can think through things. So that closes off some avenues of approach to these people. But one thing I think that is now more obvious to me than it was in the past, when a few decades ago, many people, even younger ones, could engage in argument, in the good sense of the word, argument, is that this digital society has become so unsatisfying to them. They can't be out and about without noise in their ears, a screen in front of their face. The reason they have those is because there's an emptiness. They're frightened
Right.
when they can't be hearing music and they can't be looking at the internet, when they just have to be themselves out and about, whether in the city or the countryside. They don't know how to deal with that. And they sense, I think, many of them, a kind of loneliness, kind of a spiritual loneliness. This is someplace that beauty then can take a real role.
Right.
Not that it wasn't important to have beauty. I mentioned Paul Claudel earlier, and more than a century ago, how beauty affected him. But I think that shock of beauty is something now that can be a more powerful thing for the average, especially younger person, than might have been the case 3 or 4 decades ago. So if you get such a person to see the beauty of the faith, whether it's architecture or art or music or whatever, and you can have that, they're impinged with a kind of sense, I see something that in some way could fill part of my void. I don't understand how, but now maybe I want to look towards that. Right. I want to be a little more open. I want to say that maybe there's something beyond simply looking at an illuminated glass screen, 20 hours a day. So, and I think the other thing is that I have a sense we're in a kind of wider intellectual and cultural fever, in that when someone comes down with a fever, usually the only way to resolve it is to simply let it run its course. You can't cure it per se. You simply let that fever run its course. Yeah. And then the person's exhausted at the end. He's sweating, he's exhausted, and then he starts to recover. And in a way, we're in a cultural fever, a mental fever culturally. And we might just have to let this, the indifferentism, the anti-intellectualism, the I don't care about anything attitude, run its course to the point where everybody's seeing, this is not fulfilling. I am not happy. I'm yearning for something. I have no idea what it is. And then the church, if the church is there ready, then the church can fill that vacuum.
I think this is terribly important. And what little thought I have about sort of hemorrhaging of youth, especially in today's church, coalesces around exactly that point. It goes back to Ratzinger's claim, clear back in the late 60s, early 70s, where he says, the future church, and he wasn't saying this is a good thing, he was predicting it, is going to be smaller, right. It's going to shrink, but it's going to be holier. Because essentially we're going to lose the cultural war. I mean, he knew already we were losing the cultural war. And so my attitude is, we have to come up with, we don't want to just throw up our arms and say, well, we're just going to give up. The fever's here, so we're just going to, give up. But you're spot on. There's a sense in which people say the church should do this, the church should do that. Well, maybe there isn't anything at this stage that the church can do other than simply pray, to double down on its own inner spirituality, Christological holiness, its beauty, its liturgy. Just double down on that. Stay the course. Keep doing and saying what you've been doing and saying for 2,000 years. Let the fever run its course. You're going to take your lumps. You're going to lose a lot of parishioners. You're going to hemorrhage a lot of souls. But there's not a darn thing you can do about it. So don't make the mistake, in other words, of trying to accommodate yourself to those who are leaving in order to entice them back.
Right. Nor don't fall into despair.
Or despair. Yeah.
Ratzinger was right. I mean, this is something actually that was understood by people half a century ago, long before the council even, that we're in religious decline. But there's no reason the church can't do what you just proposed. And prepare itself.
I'll use it.
Milton, they also serve who stand and wait. Okay, In a way, a role of the church now is to stand and wait, preparing itself, marshaling its strengths for that time which will come when the world will look around itself and say, none of this is working. I'm open to a solution.
We'll go,
and then
go
the
back
church
to
will
this.
have it,
Yeah. And the church, when I say the church needs to double down on what it's been doing for 2,000 years, I don't mean we need to retreat into some sort of Qumran-like fortress. We do need to engage the world. I mean, that's what you're all about. It's what I've been all about. We have to engage the world. It's just, we can't despair. We can't have a false optimism. We just need to be realists about this whole thing. But keep doing, I want to use a football analogy, and we're running out of time here, but I'm originally from Lincoln, Nebraska, so I'm a huge Nebraska football fan. College, they haven't done so well lately, but it's in my blood. But anyway, I just know, because I'm a big football fan, that whenever, for example, an offense is doing poorly and just not clicking, one of the things that coaches do is they'll simplify, and they'll say, okay, we're trying to do too much. Let's look at our 10 best plays, and let's get really, really good at running those, and let's just run those. And that's what I'm saying here about the church. We need to simplify. We need to stop, these sort of grandiose plans and schemes stuff. We need to take a look at 2,000 years of history and say, what are the 10 plays that we do well? And let's really learn those. And one of the things what we do well is beauty, liturgy, prayer, monasticism, mysticism, spirituality, community life. We do those things well. Let's just really focus on doing those well.
And do that, not just for ourselves to double down, but because there's going to be a wider audience out there who will need that beauty and what flows from it. And we don't want them to despair. I mean, they'll be at the edge of despair anyway when they turn to us, but we need to be present for them, fully equipped. We can't be in a position of an army that hasn't been formed yet, that men haven't been called up yet, that they haven't been trained yet. We have to do all of that, even if we're not immediately set to march. But there will come a time soon enough, maybe not while you and I are around, but soon enough, when the church will be the only answer people will see. And what kind of answer will we give them? And it's got to be a full, solid, intellectual, spiritual, aesthetic answer. Everything combined to show them the truth of Christ and his church. But we have to prepare ourselves for that. Otherwise, when that time comes, we will fail them. And in doing that, we will fail him.
Wow. I think that is a perfect way to end this, because it puts a perfect gloss on what apologetics ultimately is. It's a duty of Christian charity. And that we don't do this simply to convince ourselves or to feel better about ourselves. I won this argument. Look how many converts are in. We're doing this because of him, because of Christ, and the realization that the world needs him. And so we're going to double down on what we do well. We're going to continue on with apologetics because the essence of charity demands it from us, and the world needs it from us. Hey, Karl, thank you so much for coming on. I thought this was a great conversation. I knew when I met you several months ago, I said, I like this guy. And I've read your stuff. I was so happy. I was so thrilled when you were speaking there. It was Scranton, right? Were you speaking in Scranton or Wilkes-Barre?
Wilkes-Barre.
Yeah, well, Wilkes-Barre. I still don't know how the locals around here pronounce it. I think it's both ways. But it's nice meeting you again through cyberspace. I think it's been a great conversation. So stay in touch. And thank you so much. Do you have any final words?
No, just I would switch that around and say how pleased I've been to be with you today. And we had a wonderful time 6 months ago or so when we got together back there. I look forward to having an excuse to get back to Pennsylvania and maybe come out to your farm even. See your,
come visit the farm. You can help us shear the sheep. All right.
Well, maybe. We'll see.
Well, we have some nice hiking trails around here too. Right near us is a pretty decent one at Ricketts Glen State Park. But anyway, we won't go to that. Hey, thanks. We can talk about that offline. All right. Thanks everybody, and thanks for watching.